Yeah, so those cedar swamps that you're talking about there, like what, explain what those are exactly, because someone was asking me about them before. Someone had reached out and was like, "Hey, I'd love to hear, somebody come on and talk about cedar swamps a little bit."
Oh,
And I was like, I wasn't really even sure how to define that or what that was.
so our cedar swamps, which is where I spend a lot of time in these cedar swamps, any low area, right? What it is, it's all sphagnum moss, which is green, wet moss, covers the entire surface of the swamp. And then it's all cedar pole timber. So it's literally cedar. It's all open understory. And then the whole top is filled up with cedar branches. So the deer love wintering there. Great thermal cover. The wind doesn't get in there barely at all. And then the cedar, oh gosh, what the
Like
heck
the
falls off a
needles,
cedar? You
the
know what I mean?
needles,
They don't have
yeah.
really needles, but it's almost like the seeds from the cedars will drop and the deer will feed on those a little bit. But they can be huge. Like there's a couple cedar swamps up by us that it's just all the same elevation for the most part. Talking like 2, 3 foot changes in elevation, little islands here and there. But it's basically all just green moss, quiet as could be, super soft, wet moss with a wet underbody. And I mean, there's some swamps that are 600 acres of just monotonous cedar. Some of them are smaller. Anytime you've got like a little creek bottom, you'll always have like that grass and alders, and that usually gives way into cedars. So all of a sudden, there'll be a transition where you've got thick alder, like little, thumb to wrist size trees growing up all over, and then that'll transition into cedars. That's the main lowland up there is a cedar swamp.
Okay. And so a couple things there. Like when you're talking about the moss covered ground and stuff, is it like, can you walk through it? Is it's not, you're not going to sink like up to your waist or
It's
anything
it's
there,
not
right?
like a floating. Yeah, it's not floating. It just retains moisture. So a lot of times a year it'll have standing water, but the standing water's usually not deep. Couple
Okay.
inches deep, you know what I mean? And then there's lots of time of the year. If the fall, if it's not a super wet fall, it'll typically be dry. So you can sneak around in these cedar swamps without making much noise, which is really nice. You can sneak around and deer trails are really visible, and the deer definitely spend time on the edges of those cedar swamps.
That's what I was gonna ask when you're talking about, these giant areas, 600 acres of this kind of stuff, and you're saying that you like to spend a lot of time there. So what do you look for? You're looking for edges, or what are you looking for with that?
Ideally, what you're looking for, it's just like any terrain, right? It doesn't matter if it's a cedar swamp, whatever, you're looking for those changes. So ideally, the best spots I've found have been when there's some sort of change internally, whether that's some sort of elevation change. I'm thinking one spot I used to hunt that I did very well in had this slight rise, and it wasn't so slight that the ground dried up, but there was young pine trees growing there, spruce trees in this cedar swamp. So there was a bit of light coming in the canopy, and there was a thin strip, maybe 10 yards, 15 yards wide, that ran for 80 yards toward the edge of the swamp where it transitioned. And for whatever reason, just that slight change, those deer were using that, both sides of it, to cross the cedar swamp, to come on and off the hardwood ridges. So I had to stand inside that right on the tip. So I'm looking in the cedar swamp. And that was my opening day spot for Wisconsin's gun season, because tons of people would hunt around the edge of the cedar swamp, right? They'd sit up on a hardwood blind looking down at the swamp 100 yards above it. And when they'd all go get lunch, I shot $5 5 years in a row between 10 and 2, sitting in the middle of that cedar swamp, because they'd kick does, the bucks would follow does, and those deer would just use that point wherever they were on the edge to cross into safety. So it was that little change that was close to the edge and how it related to the edge was awesome. I've also found some spots where, like I mentioned, the windstorm, but there was a couple spots in that big, expansive 600-acre cedar swamp. There was a couple spots where I don't know how, but wind must have blown down just small little sections. So it'd be like a 60 yard section, 40 yards wide, where everything started tilting, right? Got hit real
Yep.
hard with wind. And then as those came down, it became loaded with browse, and you would be able to sit, between two of those or between the edge and one of those, and the deer would bed all around those blowdowns in that monotonous cedar swamp, browse on that stuff, and then they'd head out on either edge that you're close by. So my favorite thing to try to find in those cedar swamps is edges are great, especially as they relate to, like, the start of a ridge or something like that. But if you can find some sort of internal structure that those deer are relating to close to an edge, that's like one spot.
Yeah. No, that I mean, and that's very comparable to even when you look at logging cuts because, everyone knows about the edges of logging cuts and that's where a lot of hunting pressure is. And it sounds like the same with the cedar swamps. And you can find those internal edges or those little changes that are inside of that monotonous area that can really pay off. And that's like stuff that I'm assuming you can't really even tell, from an aerial map, you can't find that.
No, you can definitely can't tell on an aerial map, especially those little like fringe edges of spruce or pines. Definitely can't see those. But like you mentioned, man, people are getting better and better and better. Like we have islands in these cedar swamps that are like high ground with hardwood trees, similar to like how Dan Infalt talks about islands and cattails. Same idea. But man, every time I've ever found one of those islands and expected to be like, oh, this is gonna be, there's always some hunter sign there, like
Yeah.
because they see them on the aerial, they see it too, or on the topo. So those little like subtle changes and how those relate to the edges, man, those are my favorite places to look for as far as cedar swamps go.
Yeah, I bet you'd be able to find some of those little high rises too with using lidar in some of that, basically taking away all that timber and being able to find some of those little micro areas of rising ground there. Not to expose that, but
No,
to
no,
anybody listening, but it's
if a guy
probably
took
worth.
the I took the time and you found a large area of it and you took the time to flip it and look at that, I think that'd probably be one of the best ways to pick spots to go scout.
Yeah. Yeah, and like, and what about like, what kind of sign do you find in those areas? Like, because it's kind of swampy there, are you finding scrapes and rubs, and what do you typically finding?
They don't typically scrape in that moss, that sphagnum moss. I've seen some, but it's not a normal, they're not going to have a huge community scrape unless it's some kind of dynamite travel area. They'll make it work, but it's not nearly as prevalent as like, you follow that to the edge of the hardwoods, you're probably going to find some scrapes. But
Yeah.
they did definitely love rubbing the cedars. Very soft bark, so they're really easy to shine up. Like you can see a cedar tree that the deer maybe rub for 30 seconds and it looks like huge because they're so
Yeah.
soft. But they definitely rub in there. But as soon as you get to those, obviously those edges, like that little pocket with blowdowns, as soon as that regrowth comes up, you get those alders. I call them alders. I don't even know what they're really called, but anywhere it's down wet, they're like they kind of grow at angles, and man,
Yep.
they'll tear those up like crazy. So all of a sudden you'll see a whole bunch of those bright red, orangish color alder rubs as soon as you get around those little transition lines or those little thick pockets. So they'll rub in the cedars, but a lot of those swamps have been around so long that the cedars are all huge and they don't
Huge.
really make sign. They're just traveling the edges of it and relating to the edges.